The morning sun hadn't fully risen over Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport when Captain Darnell Okoro stepped through the crew entrance, his black roller bag gliding smoothly behind him. He wore his uniform with the kind of quiet pride that didn't need announcing: pressed navy blazer, gold wings pinned neatly over his left breast, name tag polished to a soft gleam. At 43, Darnell had spent more than half his life in the sky. He'd flown through thunderstorms over the Gulf, navigated whiteouts in the Rockies, and once safely landed a plane with a failing hydraulic system in Minneapolis. None of that made the news. But today, unbeknownst to him, would. He nodded at the gate agent, who smiled back with genuine warmth. "Morning, Captain," she said, handing him the flight manifest. "Smooth one today, I hope." "Hope so too," Darnell replied, voice calm, eyes already scanning the document. "Flight 427 Atlanta to Denver, a routine 3-hour hop. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy, just another day doing what he loved." Inside the aircraft, the cabin hummed with the low buzz of pre-flight checks. Overhead bins clicked shut, coffee machines gurgled to life, and flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency. Darnell walked down the aisle, his presence drawing a few glances. Not because he was unusual, but because captains rarely walked through the cabin before takeoff unless they had to. Most preferred to stay in the cockpit, reviewing weather or chatting with the first officer. But Darnell liked to see his crew. He believed flying wasn't just about the pilots, it was a team effort. From the gate agent to the last person folding napkins in the galley. That's when he saw her. Lila Voss stood near the forward galley, adjusting the placement of a sugar caddy with almost obsessive precision. She was in her late 50s, hair pulled into a tight silver bun, posture rigid like she'd been trained by someone who thought kindness was a sign of weakness. Darnell had never flown with her before, but he'd heard whispers. Not outright complaints, just quiet remarks from other attendants. "She's particular. She doesn't like changes. She's been here since the 90s. Their eyes met for a split second. Lila didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just looked away, as if he were a piece of equipment that had been misplaced. Darnell didn't react. He'd learned long ago that not every slight was worth confronting, especially not before a flight. He kept walking, entered the cockpit, and greeted First Officer May Lin, who was already strapped in, scrolling through the flight plan on her tablet. "Hey, Darnell," May said, flashing a quick grin. "Heard we've got Lila up front today." "Yeah," he said, stowing his bag. "I saw her." May lowered her voice. "Be careful. She's got a reputation for, well, let's just say she doesn't always treat everyone the same." Darnell gave a small, knowing nod. He didn't need to ask what she meant. As the passengers boarded, the usual rhythm of the cabin took over. Greetings, seat checks, safety demonstrations. Darnell ran through his pre-flight checklist, his fingers moving over switches and screens with the ease of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Outside, the ground crew signaled that the jet bridge was clear. Engines rumbled to life. Atlanta's skyline began to shrink beneath them as Flight 427 lifted into the pale blue sky. About 20 minutes into the flight, once the seatbelt sign clicked off and the cabin settled into its mid-air routine, Lila appeared at the cockpit door with a tray. Standard procedure. Coffee for the pilots, black for the captain, light with 1 sugar for the first officer. Darnell had specified his preference months ago in the crew briefing notes. Nothing unusual, just part of the rhythm. But when Lila handed him the cup, something felt off. She didn't say a word, didn't make eye contact, and instead of placing it gently on the console beside him, she set it down with a sharp, almost aggressive motion, so hard that coffee sloshed over the rim and spilled onto his open flight log. Dark liquid seeped into the carefully written notes about wind shear over Missouri. Darnell froze for half a second. Not out of anger, but out of disbelief. In all his years, no crew member had ever done something so blatantly disrespectful, especially not during a live flight. He looked up at her. Her expression was blank, unreadable. Then without a word, she turned and left, the cockpit door clicking shut behind her. May, who'd watched the whole thing, let out a quiet, "Wow." "Yeah," Darnell said, reaching for a cloth to dab at the spill. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. "That wasn't an accident." "No," May agreed. "That was a statement." He didn't say anything else. He finished cleaning the log as best he could, though the ink had already blurred. He knew reporting it mid-flight would only cause disruption. Passengers might get nervous, the crew would be on edge, and the airline would likely downplay it as miscommunication. So he filed it away in his mind, like he'd filed away so many other microaggressions over the years. The passenger who asked if he was really the pilot, the gate agent who double-checked his ID 3 times, the colleague who once joked, "You must have gotten in through the diversity program." He'd always let it go, always chosen professionalism over protest. But this time felt different. This wasn't a stranger's ignorance, it was a fellow crew member, someone entrusted with passenger safety, showing contempt in the middle of a flight. And it wasn't just about him. It was about every young pilot of color who'd ever been told they didn't belong in that cockpit. Every cadet who'd been told flying wasn't for people like them. Every time someone assumed the black man in uniform was the baggage handler, not the one flying the plane. Still, Darnell kept his focus on the sky. He adjusted altitude, checked fuel levels, spoke calmly with air traffic control. Outside, clouds drifted like islands in an endless sea. Inside, the tension simmered, but silently. Back in the cabin, Lila returned to the galley, her hands slightly trembling. She told herself it was nothing. Just a clumsy moment, but deep down she knew better. She'd seen Darnell's name on the crew sheet that morning. Okoro. Unfamiliar. Foreign-sounding. And when she saw him walk down the aisle in that captain's uniform, something in her had bristled. Not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. Change. A new kind of leadership she didn't understand, didn't trust, and maybe, if she was honest with herself, resented. She'd been with Skyward International for 28 years. She remembered when the cockpit was always white, always male, always predictable. Now there were women, people with accents, names she couldn't pronounce. She told herself she wasn't racist, she just preferred things the old way. But preference, when it turns into action, becomes something else entirely. Meanwhile, a junior flight attendant named Theo, just 24, wide-eyed and eager, had been restocking drinks nearby when Lila made her sharp comment in the galley after the coffee incident. Some people, she'd muttered loud enough for him to hear, get promoted just to fill a quota. Theo froze. He looked toward the cockpit, then back at Lila, unsure what to do. He admired Captain Okoro. He'd seen him speak at a crew town hall once, calm and articulate, talking about mentorship and safety culture. The idea that someone would disrespect him like this made Theo's stomach twist. He didn't say anything then, but later, when he passed the cockpit on a routine check, he leaned in slightly and whispered to May, "Hey, Lila said something pretty bad about the captain after she spilled the coffee." May's eyes narrowed. She nodded slowly, then glanced at Darnell, who was staring out at the horizon, his face unreadable. The flight continued. Passengers napped, watched movies, sipped sodas. No one knew that just behind the curtain separating cabin from cockpit, a quiet storm was gathering. Darnell thought about his father, who'd worked as a mechanic at this very airport for 30 years. The man had spent his life fixing planes he'd never be allowed to fly. "They'll let you touch the wings," he used to say, "but not steer the ship." Darnell had spent his whole career proving that wrong, not with anger, but with excellence. Every perfect landing, every smooth takeoff, every calm voice over the intercom during turbulence, it was all part of a silent promise. I belong here. And yet, here he was, wiping coffee off his logbook like he was apologizing for existing. As Denver's mountains came into view on the navigation screen, Darnell made a decision. He wouldn't let this go. Not this time. Not when it happened in the air, where trust and respect weren't just courtesies, they were safety requirements. If a crew member couldn't treat the captain with basic professionalism, what else might she overlook? A faulty oxygen mask? A misread emergency procedure? He picked up the secure radio handset. "Denver ground, this is Skyward 427. Requesting HR and security meet us at the gate upon arrival. We have an in-flight conduct issue to report." The voice on the other end paused, then replied, "Copy that, Skyward 427, noted." May looked at him, surprised but not shocked. "You sure?" "I'm sure," Darnell said. "It's not about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Outside, the plane began its descent, sunlight glinting off the wings. Inside, the air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. The flight would land in minutes. And whatever came next, Darnell knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just another routine day in the sky. This was the moment everything changed. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as Flight 427 cruised at 35,000 feet, the Rockies beginning to shimmer in the distance like jagged teeth against the horizon. Most passengers were lost in their own worlds, headphones on, blankets pulled up, eyes half closed in that strange limbo between wakefulness and sleep that only air travel creates. But in the cockpit, the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Darnell kept his hand steady on the controls, his eyes scanning the instruments with the quiet focus of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment the coffee hit his logbook, the sharp clink of the cup, the way Lila had turned away without a word. He'd spent years learning to let things roll off his back. A rude comment here, a skeptical glance there. It came with the territory when you were one of the few black captains in an industry that still carried the weight of old habits. But this wasn't just rudeness. This felt like something deeper, something deliberate. Mei Lin glanced over at him. She'd known Darnell for 6 years, flown with him through blizzards, mechanical delays, even a medical emergency over Kansas. She'd never seen him this quiet. "You okay?" she asked softly, keeping her voice low so it wouldn't carry over the cockpit intercom. "I'm fine," Darnell said, then after a pause, "No, actually I'm not." He told her about the comment Theo had passed along. Some people get promoted just to fill a quota. May's face tightened. She'd heard that kind of talk before, usually muttered in break rooms or whispered during layovers, but never on the clock. Never during a live flight, and never directed at someone who'd earned every stripe on his uniform through sheer skill and discipline. "That's not just disrespectful," May said, her voice sharp with frustration. "That's dangerous. If she's willing to sabotage your workspace over a bias, what else is she cutting corners on?" Darnell nodded slowly. He'd been thinking the same thing. In aviation, trust wasn't optional. Every person on the crew had to believe the others would do their job without hesitation, without hidden agendas. A flight attendant who couldn't treat the captain with basic respect wasn't just being petty. She was breaking that chain of trust. And in an emergency, that could cost lives. May leaned forward. "You should report it. Right now. Ground ops can log it before we even land." Darnell hesitated. He'd reported things before. Small stuff like outdated safety cards or a broken seatbelt, but never something this personal. He worried it would look like he was making a scene, that people would say he was too sensitive or playing the race card. He'd worked so hard to be seen as just a pilot, not a black pilot, not a symbol, just a professional doing his job. Bringing this up felt like stepping out of that carefully built identity, but then he thought about the young cadet he'd mentored last year. A kid from Detroit with big dreams and nervous hands who'd asked him, "Do you ever feel like they're watching you twice as hard?" Darnell had told him every day, "But that's why we fly better. That's why we stay sharp." If he stayed silent now, what message would that send? He picked up the radio again. This time, he called Skyward's internal operations line, the one used for crew concerns, not emergencies. A calm voice answered on the third ring. "Skyward Ops, this is Captain Okoro on Flight 427. I need to file an in-flight conduct report." He spoke clearly, factually, no anger, no exaggeration. He described the coffee incident, the spill on his operational log, and the comment overheard by another crew member. He emphasized that this wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about crew cohesion and safety protocol. The operator listened, took notes, and assured him the report would be escalated immediately to both HR and the chief pilot on duty. When he hung up, May let out a slow breath. "Good," she said. That needed to be said. Back in the cabin, Lila was refilling water bottles in the galley, her movements brisk, almost mechanical. She hadn't noticed Theo's worried glances or the way the other attendants had subtly distanced themselves since her comment. She told herself she was just being honest. Why pretend everything was fine when the industry kept changing in ways she didn't understand? She'd worked hard for her seniority. She knew the rules. She didn't need some diversity hire telling her how to do her job. But deep down a small voice whispered, "Was that really about him? Or about your own fear of becoming irrelevant?" She pushed the thought away. Instead, she focused on the routine. checking the lavatory supplies, counting snack boxes, smoothing her uniform. Anything to avoid the quiet unease growing in her chest. Meanwhile, Theo hovered near the rear galley, heart pounding. He'd never been in a situation like this before. He admired Captain Okoro, not just because of his rank, but because of the way he carried himself. Calm, kind, always asking how the crew was doing. The idea that someone would treat him like that made Theo feel sick. He wanted to say something, but he was just a junior attendant. What could he do? Then he remembered the cockpit camera. Every Skyward aircraft had internal recording in the flight deck, not for spying, but for safety reviews after incidents. If the captain filed a report, they'd pull that footage. And if they did, they'd see exactly how Lila had slammed that cup down. Theo didn't say anything out loud, but he made a silent promise to himself. If anyone asked, he'd tell the truth. Not to get Lila in trouble, but because the truth mattered. Especially up here where there was no room for lies. As the plane began its descent into Denver, the cabin crew prepared for landing. Lila moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, reminding passengers to stow trays and fasten seatbelts. Her voice was steady, professional. No one would have guessed the storm inside her. But Darnell knew. He watched the runway lights appear through the windshield, bright and steady against the fading afternoon light. His hands moved with calm precision, reducing speed, adjusting flaps, speaking with air traffic control in that smooth, measured tone passengers found so reassuring. Outside, the world rushed up to meet them. Inside, time seemed to slow. When the wheels touched down with a soft thud, the passengers clapped lightly, the usual ritual of relief and routine. But Darnell didn't smile. He taxied toward the gate, his mind already on what came next. He didn't know it yet. But the moment the plane stopped, everything would change. As the engines powered down and the seatbelt sign clicked off, Darnell stayed in his seat. Me stayed too. They waited, and sure enough, within minutes a knock came at the cockpit door. It wasn't a flight attendant. It was two airport security officers in dark uniforms, accompanied by a woman in a navy suit, Elena Ruiz, Skyward's regional HR manager. She looked tense but composed, her expression carefully neutral. "Captain Okoro?" she said when he opened the door. "We're here regarding your report." Darnell nodded. "I appreciate you coming so quickly." Elena stepped inside, glancing at May, then back at Darnell. "Can you walk me through what happened?" He did, again calmly, factually. No drama, no accusations. Just the sequence of events, the coffee, the spill, the overheard comment, the concern for crew dynamics and safety. Elena listened without interrupting, taking notes on a tablet. When he finished, she exhaled softly. "Thank you for bringing this forward. We take all reports of discriminatory conduct seriously, especially when it impacts operational integrity." She turned to the security officers and gave a small, and then they walked back into the cabin. Lila was in the forward galley, collecting used headsets when she saw them approach. Her stomach dropped. She'd seen HR at gates before, usually for lost luggage disputes or passenger complaints, but never with security, and never looking directly at her. "Lila Voss?" Elena asked, voice firm but not unkind. Lila straightened. "Yes, I need you to come with us. You're being placed on administrative leave pending investigation into an in-flight conduct issue." Lila's eyes widened. "What for what?" "I just poured coffee." "It's not just about the coffee," Elena said gently but firmly. "There are additional concerns. Please gather your personal items. You won't be returning to duty today." Lila stood frozen for a moment, her face pale. Around her, passengers were still filing out, oblivious. A few turned to look as the security officers stepped closer, not to restrain her but to escort her. Professional, quiet, but unmistakable. One elderly woman paused, frowning. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked Lila. Lila opened her mouth, but no words came out. She grabbed her small purse from the jump seat, her hands shaking. Then, with her uniform still perfectly pressed, her name tag still gleaming, she walked down the jet bridge not as a crew member, but as someone being removed. Theo watched from the rear of the plane, his heart in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, but he stayed silent. This wasn't his moment. It was theirs. Back in the cockpit, Darnell finally unstrapped and stood. He felt exhausted, not from the flight, but from the weight of what had just happened. May put a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said. He nodded. But he didn't feel victorious. He felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that respect still had to be fought for, even in the sky. Outside, the Denver wind picked up, rustling the wings of the grounded aircraft. Somewhere in the terminal, a phone camera was already rolling, and within the hour, the first blurry video would appear online. Flight attendant dragged off plane after disrespecting black pilot. But Darnell didn't know that yet. All he knew was that he'd chosen truth over silence, and sometimes that was enough. The moment Lila Voss stepped off the jet bridge in Denver, still in full uniform but flanked by 2 security officers, someone in the terminal pulled out their phone. It wasn't a journalist or an activist, just a passenger named Raj, heading home after a business trip, who happened to glance over as the small group passed by. He saw the look on Lila's face, confused, humiliated, stunned, and the crisp skyward logo on her blazer. Without thinking, he hit record. The video lasted only 12 seconds. No audio, just shaky footage of Lila walking stiffly, eyes down, while the officers stayed half a step behind her, not touching her, not speaking, just present. The caption Raj posted read, "Flight attendant dragged off plane after disrespecting black pilot?" He didn't know all the details. He'd overheard a snippet from another passenger, something about coffee and a captain, but it was enough to spark curiosity. Within an hour, the clip had been shared over 10,000 times. By the time Darnell Okoro finally left the aircraft, long after the last passenger had disembarked, after he'd completed his post-flight checklist, after he'd spoken quietly with May about what came next, the story was already spiraling. His phone buzzed nonstop in his bag, texts from fellow pilots, voicemails from news outlets, a concerned message from his sister. "Are you okay? I saw something online." He didn't check any of it, not yet. He walked through the terminal with his roller bag, head down, trying to disappear into the flow of travelers. But people noticed. A young man in a pilot training t-shirt did a double take, then gave him a small, respectful nod. An older woman whispered to her friend, "That's him." Darnell kept walking. He just wanted to get to his hotel, take a shower, and breathe. But the world wasn't going to let him. Skyward International's corporate office in Chicago had been in emergency mode since the moment Elena Ruiz filed her preliminary report. By 4:17 p.m. Mountain Time, their social media team was monitoring a flood of comments. By 5:03 p.m., their PR department had drafted a statement. By 5:45 p.m., it went live. Skyward International is aware of an incident involving crew members on Flight 427. This is a personnel matter currently under internal review. We are committed to maintaining a respectful and professional workplace for all employees and will take appropriate action based on the findings. It was careful, neutral, designed to calm, not inflame. It did the opposite. Online, people tore it apart. "Personnel matter?" One viral post read, "When a black captain gets disrespected mid-flight and the airline calls it a personnel matter, that's code for we'll sweep it under the rug." Others dug deeper. Someone found Lila's LinkedIn profile. 28 years at Skyward, no disciplinary record listed. Another user posted a side-by-side photo. Darnell in full uniform standing tall beside his aircraft, and Lila in a decades-old staff photo, arms crossed, expression stern. The contrast was stark and people drew their own conclusions, but not everyone rushed to judgment. In pilot forums and aviation groups, voices of caution emerged. "Let the process work," one retired captain wrote. "We don't know the full context." Others pointed out that flight attendants also faced immense pressure, long hours, difficult passengers, constant scrutiny. "Don't crucify someone based on a 12-second clip," warned a veteran attendant with 200K followers. Still, the narrative had taken hold. A respected black pilot, treated with open contempt by a veteran crew member, forced to call security after enduring years of quiet bias. It fit a pattern people recognized, and whether all the facts were in or not, it felt true to too many. Back in Denver, Lila sat alone in a small conference room near the airport's employee services office. She'd been given water, a chair, and instructions to wait. No one yelled at her. No one accused her outright. But the silence was worse. She kept replaying the flight in her head, The coffee, the comment, the way Theo had looked at her afterward. Had she really said quota? She couldn't remember the exact words, but she knew the feeling behind them. And that was enough. She thought about calling her daughter, but what would she say? I got removed from a flight because I couldn't hide how I felt about the captain. Shame coiled in her stomach like a stone. Meanwhile, Darnell finally checked his phone in the quiet of his hotel room. He scrolled through the headlines, the memes, the heated debates. Some posts praised him as a hero. Others called him dramatic for making a big deal out of spilled coffee. One comment read, "If he's so professional, why didn't he just ignore it?" Darnell stared at that one for a long time. Ignoring it was what he'd always done. And look where it got him, still having to prove over and over that he belonged. He turned off his phone and sat by the window, watching planes take off in the distance. He wasn't angry. He was tired of being the example, tired of carrying the weight of other people's expectations, both those who wanted him to be perfect and those who wanted him to fail. The next morning, Skyward called him. Not HR this time. Corinne Delgado, the airline's chief operating officer. She spoke plainly without corporate fluff. "Darnell, I've reviewed the cockpit footage and the statements from your crew. What happened wasn't acceptable. Not by our standards, not by industry standards, and certainly not by basic human decency." She paused. "We're going to do right by you. But I need to know, what do you want to see happen?" Darnell didn't ask for Lila to be fired. He didn't demand a public apology or a media tour. "I want accountability," he said. "And I want this to be the last time a pilot, any pilot, has to choose between staying silent and risking safety." Corinne listened. Then she said, "Consider it done." But outside the airline's walls, the story kept growing. A local Denver news station tracked down Theo. He agreed to speak. Off camera, voice altered. But his account matched Darnell's. "She didn't just spill the coffee," he said. "She did it like she wanted him to know it wasn't an accident. And then she said something about quotas. I heard it. Others did too." That interview tipped the scales. Skyward updated their statement. Based on preliminary findings, the crew member in question has been placed on indefinite administrative leave. A full investigation is underway, including review of cockpit recordings and witness statements. The phrase cockpit recordings sent a new wave through the aviation community. Pilots understood what that meant. This wasn't just about feelings. This was about documented behavior during a live flight, and in aviation, documentation was everything. Lila's union representative reached out to her that afternoon. They explained her rights, the investigation process, the possible outcomes. Termination was on the table. So was retraining. So was early retirement with benefits. "You need to decide what you're willing to own," the rep told her gently. "Because the video doesn't lie." That night, Lila sat at her kitchen table in her Denver apartment. She'd been scheduled for a layover, so she wasn't even home in Atlanta. She stared at her Skyward badge, the one she'd worn every workday for nearly 3 decades. She thought about the young attendants she'd trained, the passengers she'd comforted during turbulence, the pride she once felt putting on that uniform, and she wondered when it had turned into something else, something rigid, something closed off. She didn't hate Darnell Okoro. She barely knew him. What she'd reacted to wasn't him. It was the fear that the world she'd mastered was slipping away and she didn't know how to hold on. But fear wasn't an excuse. Not up in the air. Not when lives were on the line. By the 3rd day, the story had reached national news. Not because of outrage, but because of what came next. Skyward announced they would be launching a company-wide review of crew conduct policies, with input from diversity and safety experts. They also revealed that Captain Okoro had volunteered to help design new training modules focused on inclusive leadership and team cohesion. Darnell didn't do it for publicity. He did it because he believed change was possible, even for people like Lila, even for systems as old as commercial aviation. And then, quietly, something unexpected happened. A former Skyward attendant, retired for 10 years, posted a public message. "I worked with Lila in the 90s. She was tough, but she cared. If this is a wake-up call for her, maybe it's one for all of us." The comment got thousands of likes, not because it excused what happened, but because it reminded people that humans are complicated, that growth is possible, that sometimes the most powerful moment isn't the fall, But what comes after? As Darnell prepared for his next flight, a red-eye to Seattle, he packed his bags slowly. He didn't know how this would end. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he hadn't just protected himself. He'd protected the future. For every kid who looked up at a plane and dreamed of flying it, no matter their name, their skin, or their story, he'd made the sky a little more welcoming, and that, he thought as he zipped his bag shut, was worth every second of the storm. The investigation into what happened on Flight 427 moved faster than anyone expected. Within 5 days, Skyward International's internal review team had interviewed every crew member, analyzed the cockpit video frame by frame, and cross-referenced Lila Voss's personnel file with past passenger feedback and peer evaluations. What they found wasn't a single explosive moment, it was a pattern. Small things, mostly. A sharp tone with newer attendants who didn't do it the right way. A habit of questioning decisions made by younger or non-white supervisors. Nothing that rose to the level of formal discipline, but enough to paint a picture of someone resisting change in an industry that couldn't afford rigidity. But the real turning point came not from the airline's report, it came from Darnell Okoro himself. He'd been asked to meet with Skyward's Ethics Committee, a small group of senior leaders and external advisors brought in specifically for sensitive cases like this. They expected him to demand consequences, maybe even push for Lila's termination. Instead, Darnell surprised them. "I don't want her fired just to make a point," he said, sitting calmly in the conference room, hands folded on the table. "I want her to understand why what she did mattered. Not just to me, but to the whole crew, to the passengers, to the idea that we're all supposed to trust each other up there." He paused, then added, "If she can't see that, then she shouldn't be flying. But if she can, maybe there's still a place for her. Just not in the same role." His words spread quietly through the company, not as a headline, but as a whisper in break rooms and pilot lounges. The captain didn't ask for punishment. He asked for understanding. Meanwhile, Lila sat in her Atlanta home, back from her layover on paid leave, waiting. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a deep, gnawing unease. She'd replayed the cockpit footage in her mind 100 times. She hadn't seen the actual video. Skyward hadn't released it, but she remembered the weight of the cup in her hand, the way she'd set it down harder than she needed to, the satisfaction she'd felt in that split second of defiance. It wasn't about the coffee. It was about control, about pushing back against a world that kept moving without asking her if she was ready. But now, alone in her quiet house, that satisfaction felt hollow. Her daughter, Mara, came over one evening with takeout and a worried look. "Mom," she said gently, "people are talking. Not just online, my coworker saw your name in an article. Is it true? Did you disrespect the captain?" Lila didn't answer right away. She stirred her soup, eyes down. "I didn't mean it like that," she finally said. I've been doing this job since before he was flying solo. And suddenly everything's changing. New rules, new faces, new ways of doing things. I guess I felt invisible." Mara reached across the table and took her hand. "Feeling invisible doesn't give you the right to make someone else feel small." The words landed hard. Lila blinked back tears. She'd spent her whole career priding herself on professionalism, on never letting emotion interfere with duty. But this time, emotion had won, and it had cost her more than she realized. A few days later, Skyward offered her a choice: resign quietly with full retirement benefits, or enter a restorative accountability program, a new initiative Darnell had quietly supported. It wasn't therapy exactly. It was a 6-week course co-designed with aviation psychologists and diversity specialists, focused on bias awareness, team dynamics, and emotional regulation in high-stress environments. If she completed it successfully, she could return to the airline, but not as a flight attendant. She'd be reassigned to ground-based training, helping new hires understand not just safety procedures, but the human side of crew interaction. It was a demotion, but it was also a lifeline. Lila didn't decide right away. She walked through her neighborhood that weekend, past kids riding bikes and neighbors tending gardens, thinking about the uniform hanging in her closet. She'd worn it like armor for nearly 30 years. Letting it go felt like losing a part of herself. But maybe, she thought, that part had been weighing her down. While Lila wrestled with her decision, Darnell's story began to take on a life of its own, not as a scandal, but as a catalyst. Reporters who'd initially come for drama found something deeper. They learned that Darnell wasn't just Skyward's first black captain. He'd also spent years mentoring young pilots from underrepresented backgrounds, often using his own money to help cover exam fees or simulator time. He'd spoken at high schools and underserved communities, not with grand speeches but with simple honesty. If you can do the math, stay calm under pressure and care about people, you belong in this cockpit. One journalist asked him why he'd stayed in aviation despite the barriers. He smiled faintly. Because every time I fly, I'm proving someone wrong. And that's a good reason to keep showing up. His restraint in the aftermath of the incident earned him respect far beyond the airline. The National Coalition of Black Pilots invited him to keynote their annual conference. A documentary filmmaker reached out about a short film on quiet courage in high-stakes professions. Even rival airlines quietly acknowledged that Skyward had handled the situation with unusual transparency. But Darnell didn't want fame. He wanted change. He started meeting with Skyward's training division not as a victim, but as a partner. Together, they redesigned the crew briefing protocol to include a short team alignment moment before every flight. Just 30 seconds where everyone states their name, role, and one thing they're watching for that day. Simple, human. It reminded everyone that they weren't just roles. They were people relying on each other. He also pushed for the cockpit camera footage from Flight 4 and 27 to be used, not as punishment but as a teaching tool. With Lila's permission, which she eventually gave, a sanitized version, faces blurred, voices altered, was shown in new anti-bias workshops. Not to shame, but to show how small actions can fracture trust in seconds. Back in Atlanta, Lila finally made her choice. She enrolled in the program. The first session was hard. She sat in a circle with other employees, some from customer service, some from maintenance, who'd also been referred for interpersonal conduct concerns. The facilitator didn't lecture. She asked questions. When did you first feel like an outsider? When did you last make someone else feel that way? What does respect look like when you're exhausted, stressed, or afraid? Lila didn't speak much at first, but by week 3 she raised her hand. I thought respect meant following the rules, she said, voice quiet. But I didn't realize it also meant making space for people who don't look or sound like you did when you started. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone nodded. Another said, I've been there too. It wasn't forgiveness. It was understanding. And for the first time in years, Lila felt like she wasn't alone. As the weeks passed, Skyward began rolling out its new policies. Mandatory bias training for all 12,000 crew members. A confidential reporting line for microaggressions or safety concerns, with guaranteed follow-up within 48 hours. And a new hiring initiative, Pathways to the Flight Deck, aimed at recruiting more pilots of color through partnerships with historically black colleges and flight schools. Darnell agreed to lead the first cohort. He stood in front of a room of 20 nervous cadets, some fresh out of high school, others career changers in their 30s, and told them the truth. You'll face doubt. Maybe from passengers, maybe from coworkers, maybe even from yourself. But your job isn't to prove them wrong. It's to fly the plane so well that their doubt becomes irrelevant. One young woman raised her hand. What if they still don't see you as the captain? Darnell met her eyes. Then you keep flying, and you make sure the next person after you doesn't have to fight as hard. Meanwhile, Lila completed her program. She wasn't the same person who'd boarded Flight 427. She still carried her pride, but now it was softer, less about how long she'd been there, and more about what she could still give. When Skyward offered her the training role, she accepted. Her first assignment? Co-leading a session on respect in the air with Theo, the junior attendant who'd spoken up. At first it was awkward, but then Theo shared how scared he'd been to say anything, and Lila admitted how blind she'd been to her own impact. By the end, they weren't just instructor and former crewmate. They were two people who'd learned painfully that growth is possible at any age. No one called it redemption. That word felt too grand, but something real had shifted. And in the quiet spaces between headlines and policy changes, that was what mattered most. Not the moment someone fell, but the courage it took to stand back up, look the truth in the eye and choose to do better.